Welcome to part 2. In this video, we're going to construct the head and body out of foam, and then we're going to drape the pattern for the fur and cover it. Using pre-made patterns is a good way to start off if you're a beginning puppet builder. But if you're taking this serious, I encourage you to try making your own pattern. The process is tedious, but it's a lot of fun. If you already downloaded the templates from my website, you can skip over the pattern making process. For the monster character, I like to use L200. L200 is a closed cell foam, and it's a little stiffer from the foam from the last project. If you want to order some of this, there's a link in the description. I like to use 1/2 inch foam. So let me start off by tracing out the top of the head. So the top of the skull and the body are all traced out. I'm going to use a sharp X-Acto blade to cut out the pieces. Now to glue these together, I like to use contact cement. A lot of people use a brand called Barge, but I prefer to use Masters. There's really not too much of a difference. Make sure you do this outside or in a very well ventilated area. If not, you have to use a respirator because the fumes are not healthy. I have a couple fans going in great ventilation, so I'll be fine. It's also a good idea to use gloves too. I'm gonna let these sit for a couple minutes. Once they're tacky, we can put it together. I'm gonna start off closing the darts on these pieces. Then putting those pieces together. Now there's the body. Now let's stick the head together. For the head, I'm going to do the darts first too. Just like that. So here are the pieces so far. We have the body, the upper half of the head, and the bottom jaw. Now we're going to draw out a mouth plate. To do that, I'm going to trace about half the circumference of the skull. And here are the mouth plates that I just made. I cut these out from a Tupperware container. Click here for a detailed video on how to make the mouth plates. This one's for the top and has individual finger loops. This one's for the bottom jaw and has a thumb loop. Now let's attach them. We're going to let that glue set for a little bit. And then we'll line up the center line with the center notch. And now the top of the head. Lining it up just like that. And there we have it. Let's try this on like this. And it's starting to look like a puppet. Now we're going to make the fabric pattern for the fur covering of the head. To do that, I'm going to temporarily tape these two pieces together. Kind of acts as a joint. I'll put it on the stand. That way we can make our pattern around that. And I'll put a piece of tape there so the mouth isn't open all the way. But I do want it a little bit open for making the pattern. For draping the pattern, I'm just going to use some scrap fleece. Make sure that the stretch is going across. There we go. I'll lay that on like that. And I'll start to pin it on. The goal of this is to get the fabric to lay as flat as possible to the foam. There you go. I'm just adding pins to hold the darts together. I'll cut off some of the extra. I'll start drawing some of the lines. I'm going to start off by doing the center seam. So I just trace along the same seam on the foam. Keep pulling back to peek, make sure I'm on the same track. I'll trace along the darts on the side. Now this is the mark for the opening of the mouth. And that looks about right. Let's take it off and see what we have. So there we have our fleece pattern. So that's the cover pattern for the head. Now let's do the same thing with the body. Again, make sure your stretch is going across. Now you may have noticed I only covered half of the head. That's because I'm going to mirror the pattern. I'm going to do the same thing with the body. So I'm only going to cover half of it. So here I go. Again, the goal is to get this as flat as you can to the foam. That looks pretty snug. Let me trim some of the extra off. Now I'll trace the lines. I'm going to start off going around the perimeter. I'm going to label this at the top too. And follow along those sidelines. There we go. Now let's see what we have. That's looking good. Now I'm going to trace these on the paper. All right, here's some brown paper. Let's start tracing. Okay, you want to lay it flat. Make sure it's all centered there. This is a tracing wheel. It's used for pattern making. There's a link for this down in the description. You want to make sure the pattern doesn't slide around at all. And then you just carefully press down. And what it does is it makes little punctures. I don't know if you can see that in the video. But it transfers the pattern onto there by putting little holes. You can dispose of this. And I'll trace it out. I'm going to add a 1/2 inch of seam allowance around the inside of the lip too. There we have it. And now for the lower body. We're going to do the same thing. Okay, and there's the lower body. So right now we have the covering for our body and for the head, but the part that connects them is the upper body. And if you remember, we had this piece here that we have from our sculpture, and that came out to this pattern piece. But this is not quite the right scale because this is proportioned to the foam pattern. So I'm going to line it up to make sure that the bottom is the same length as the top of this pattern, and that the top is the same length as the bottom of the neck. And that should get us to the right pattern. Now let's see here. The neck is about 5.5 inches long. And let's see what this is. About 5 inches long, perfect. And let's check the bottom. It's about 7 inches long there, and about 6.5 here. So we only have to add a 1/2 inch around this whole pattern to get the right shape. I'll trace that out. Now let's cut it out. Now let's make the fabric mouthplate pattern. I'm going to make it by tracing the mouthplate pattern. I'm going to add about an inch in between. Here's the pattern, now let's cut it out of the fabric. Common fabrics for mouthplate are felt and velvet. My preference is velvet. Also, people like to use black or red. I just ran out of red, so I'm going to use the black. A silver Sharpie is a good thing to use when tracing on dark fabrics. If you want the mouthplate fabric all the way to the edge, add a seam allowance. I like to have a small lip of fur roll over, so I don't need to add any seam allowance. Now I'll cut it out. Now we can start cutting them out of fur. The Mongolian fur is my favorite to use. It's going to be perfect for this character. Now you want to make sure you pay attention to the direction of the fur. In this case, I want it going down. I'm going to orient my pattern this way. Start tracing it out. And now the upper body. When cutting out fur, you want to use a sharp razor blade from the back of the netting. Also, if you're going to sew this up on a machine, you want to add about a ½ inch of seam allowance. Click here for the video on sewing a puppet by hand. Now I'm going to pin it together and stitch it up on the machine. So there we have most of it sewn together. It's pretty much all stitched up, except for, of course, the mouth. And also, I like to leave the back seam open so I can close up the whole thing all at once. Now I'm going to pin in the mouthplate fabric. Be sure to line up the center notches. Okay, that's all pinned in. Now I'm going to go stitch it up. It's all stitched up, so now we're going to glue the foam head into the fabric. Don't forget to take the tape out. To glue it, I'm going to use Super 77 spray adhesive. Spray the inside of the fabric mouth. Try not to get any on the fur. It's important to get a good covering, but you don't want to oversaturate it because it could leak through the fabric. I'm going to let these sit for a second to get a little tacky. Now I'm going to place it in. I like to start with the bottom jaw first. Make sure you don't accidentally put it on the wrong end. It's not fun. But be sure to line up the center seam with the center seam of the fabric. Just like that. It's important to get it to lay flat. You don't want any wrinkles stuck in there. So it's glued in there. It doesn't look like much now, but when I turn it inside out, it's gonna start to look like a puppet. There we go, it's coming along. Now the body gets placed right inside here. You can see it fits perfectly. But before I place it in, I'm going to stitch up this whole back seam. If you want to, you can stitch it halfway, place it in, and then continue stitching it. But luckily this foam is pretty flexible. So I like to stitch this whole seam and then force the foam inside. Let's start stitching. Now let's put the body in. He's gonna need a lot of grooming too, but we're gonna wait till he's completely put together first. As you probably noticed, building a puppet takes a long time. If you're looking for something interesting to listen to while you're building, check out our podcast called Puppeteers. We've been able to interview and talk to a bunch of really well-known puppeteers from the industry. We talk about everything from the performing to the business of puppetry. So that's it for now. In the next video, we're gonna make the foam hands and feet, as well as the fur coverings for them. After that, it's pretty much just the details. And there's a bunch of links to that below. Thanks for hanging out. See you soon.